Welcome to another session of IntelliQuest's The World's 100 Greatest Books. In this session, we'll discuss Camille, the most famous book and play written by Alexandre Dumas the Younger, or Alexandre Dumas Fils, as he is known in France and throughout the literary world. His father, Alexandre Dumas Père, or Alexandre Dumas the Elder, was one of the most famous and productive authors in the 1800s. We'll soon talk about the colorful Dumas family, but first let's take a brief look at the story of Camille. The book Camille, which is also known as The Lady of the Camellias, was first published in 1847. It was a great success for Dumas the Younger, and established his reputation as a literary person in his own right, separate from his world-famous father. It was even more successful as a play. Although we will review it in book form, the play has been performed worldwide by some of the greatest actors in the world. The most famous production of Camille is probably the 1937 film version starring Greta Garbo. You may be most familiar with the Camille story as it's told in the opera La Traviata by Giuseppe Verdi. La Traviata was written while the book and play were at the height of their fame and has enthralled audiences for almost 150 years. La Traviata is considered one of the finest operas ever written. Franco Zeffirelli filmed a version in the 1980s, a sumptuous movie that captures the sensual Parisian life of the last century. Camille is the story of a high-paid Parisian prostitute dying of tuberculosis who falls in love with an infatuated young man. Why is the story still so popular? Actually, audiences sometimes laugh at its old-fashioned ideas, but the core of Dumas' first and most famous work is the experience of love. This is what makes the work attractive even now. Alexandre Dumas often wrote about prostitutes, illegitimate children, and adultery. He knew firsthand the consequences of being born without society's blessing. His father never married his mother, and the family had a history of mistresses and children born out of wedlock. Let's look at the Dumas family, a colorful and famous French dynasty. Dumas the Younger's grandfather was born in the West Indies in 1762 to a French officer and a black slave who probably did not marry. His name was Thomas Alexandre Dumas, and he grew up to be an especially attractive and virile man. He became a famous general in the French army and served under Napoleon. He was renowned for his bravery and physical strength. General Dumas was severely poisoned while he was a prisoner of war, and though he could keep his family in relative comfort, neither Napoleon nor the army ever compensated him for his tremendous suffering in service to his country. He deeply loved his son Alexandre, a fair little boy with blue eyes, whose only sign of a black heritage was crinkly hair. When the general died at 40, young Alexandre was told that the good God had taken his father. Alexandre asked where God lived, and was told that God lived in the sky. Alexandre calmly went and got his father's gun. His mother asked where he was going, and he said, "To the sky, to kill the good God who has killed Papa." This incident indicates the fearless and adventurous nature of Dumas the Elder, who wrote such classics as The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo. The Three Musketeers is the subject of another instant expert session. By the time he was 18, Dumas the Elder was already known as a sportsman, a lover, and an adventurer. He went to Paris to make his fortune as a playwright, and there met a lovely young dressmaker named Catherine Labaille. They lived together but never married, and she gave birth to Alexandre the Younger on July 27, 1824. Dumas kept at his writing, and by his late 20s he had achieved fame and fortune, just like his good friend Victor Hugo. Dumas specialized in historical adventures at a time when adding psychological realism to historical characters was very popular. This was a time of political upheaval in France, and the streets of Paris were, on a few occasions, literally battle places. Dumas the Elder felt exhilarated by a conflict, and the times suited him. He insisted on custody of his son Alexandre, much against the wishes of Alexandre's mother. This custody battle, where Alexandre saw his faithful mother victimized by his powerful father, a man who was publicly living with other women, may have helped form Alexandre's idea about injustice towards women. He was sent to boarding school, where he was harassed because his parents weren't married. He later said, "The bitterness which I felt in those days has never been entirely set at rest, even in the happiest days of my life." Although father and son were both commanding figures in adulthood, The younger Dumas was more inclined to self-examination and moral reform. The elder Dumas was finally married in 1840, much to his son's chagrin, to an actress named Ida Ferrier, who was not the mother of either of Dumas the elder's children. Alexandre the elder eventually had 2 daughters by 2 different mistresses. In the long run, Dumas the younger turned his back on his father's wild ways of extravagant spending, promiscuity, and high living. Dumas the elder, between 1845 and 1855, produced more books than most people would probably read in a lifetime. There is a saying that no single person has read everything that Dumas the elder wrote, but that everyone has read something that he wrote. Since a great deal of his works were French historical novels, many people learned their history from him. This history may not have always been accurate, but it certainly made good reading. Meanwhile, Dumas the younger was a handsome young man, having his first taste of Parisian pleasures. At this time in France, the mid-1800s, there was a romanticized view of prostitution, which unfortunately we still see today in such films as Pretty Woman. This story of the prostitute with a heart of gold who was rescued by one of her clients is an absurd but centuries-old dramatic theme. Dumas the younger frequented the theaters, balls, and cafes where the beautiful young kept women were often seen. But there were few such high-paid courtesans, because then, as now, most prostitutes had a life filled with violence, disease, addiction, and poverty. In 1844, Dumas the younger met an elegant young prostitute named Marie Duplessis and fell in love with her. She was considered one of the most beautiful and desired women in Paris. She was also a spendthrift and suffered from tuberculosis. Marie was the model for Marguerite, the Lady of the Camellias. Dumas used his experiences to write Camille, even down to the detail of Marie's love for the camellia flower. But Dumas was not wealthy enough to support Marie's lifestyle, and was extremely jealous of sharing her with those who could keep her in jewels, carriages, and beautiful clothes. After a year of being her occasional lover, he sent her a letter saying, "I am neither rich enough to love you as I would wish, nor poor enough to be loved by you as you would. You have too much heart not to understand the reasons for this letter, and too much intelligence not to forgive me." In 1846, father and son went on a tour of Spain and Algeria, where Dumas Sr. wrote about and had a number of adventures. Dumas the younger wrote to Marie, concerned that her illness had gotten worse, and asking forgiveness for breaking with her. Marie had been deeply hurt by Dumas' rejection, but eventually became indifferent to her feelings as she went from lover to lover, struggling for financial survival. In early 1846, a French nobleman took her to England, where they were married in a civil ceremony which was not recognized in France. His motivation was probably to do a kindness to a dying woman. In February 1847, Marie died of tuberculosis. Dumas still loved her, and when he returned to Paris, he reviewed her letters. Then he wrote the book that is the subject of our session, Camille. It was very fashionable at that time for writers to romanticize their affairs and turn them into popular fiction. Camille is not completely autobiographical, because Dumas didn't try to change Marie as his hero does in the book. Dumas the elder, from his tremendous profits on the book, The Count of Monte Cristo, built himself a fabulous chateau. It was described by the infamous French novelist Balzac as the most royal chocolate box in existence. It cannot be sold, for Dumas the elder has no written agreement for the land on which it stands. This gives you some idea of the way in which Dumas does things. Dumas was extravagant, frequently in debt, and still writing at a great pace. Eventually, he wrote more than 400 novels and 36 plays, but he lost his fabulous chateau because of poor money management. Dumas the younger turned 25 in 1849, and soon after became the lover of a Russian countess. For a year he pursued the woman and her husband across Belgium and Germany, but when he reached the Russian border in Poland, he was stopped by officials. Through a strange set of circumstances, Dumas there found love letters written by the French authoress Georges Sand to the Polish composer Frédéric Chopin. This led to a lifelong friendship between Dumas and Sand, who took a motherly interest in him. While Dumas the elder struggled to pay his debts, his eldest daughter came to live with her father. Annoyed with his many mistresses, she pretended to accidentally give the different women information about each other. In this way, Dumas' mistresses, former lovers, and estranged wife were frequently angry with him as they discovered what he was doing with their rivals. This was his daughter's best revenge. His son's revenge, if it can be called that, was to moralize through his plays. In 1852, The Lady of the Camellias was first performed as a play to tremendous success. Dumas took his mother out to celebrate on opening night to honor her. The theme of many of Dumas' plays was his condemnation of adultery, the problems that illegitimate children have in society, and promiscuity. This theme continued as Dumas produced some of the most popular French plays of the 1800s. But while he was writing in support of traditional married values, he fell in love with another married Russian princess, and the two lived together for many years. He wanted to marry the princess, but her husband refused to divorce her, in keeping with the Russian religious values of that time. By 1860, both father and son were famous, although while the father wrote about fantastic adventures, the son wrote about real life as he understood it. Dumas the younger found his father's continued indebtedness and mistresses disgusting, and they had a number of falling outs. That made it all the more embarrassing when Dumas the younger became the father of an illegitimate daughter by his Russian mistress. Georges Sand provided Dumas the younger with a great deal of support and insight during this time, including the subject matter for Dumas the younger's most controversial play. She described to Dumas how horrible a girl's first sexual experience can be if her partner is indifferent to her. Dumas used this in a play that shocked Paris by referring to such delicate matters, although it seems hypocritical for Paris to be shocked by anything sexual. The shock was due to Dumas' realism, which forced the public to put aside their romantic fantasies about sex and look at a very real, if unspoken, issue, and made people examine their lives, feelings, motivations, and behavior. Frequently in his plays, Dumas would present a male character who would be all-knowing, a seemingly wise person who can look into the heart of anyone. This character stood for Dumas, who was rather conceited about his high-mindedness. He finally married his princess when her husband died, and they also acknowledged his daughter as his heir. Her name was Colette, and she could speak 3 languages in childhood. Dumas loved her a great deal, happy to finally lead the kind of legal union that he preached about. He had a second daughter, but the marriage was not a happy one. The princess had emotional problems that made Dumas feel he could not leave her, even in later life. Dumas also was unhappy about his father's newest child, an illegitimate daughter he conceived with a very young woman. Dumas the younger seldom visited his father, who once said, "I never see my son now except at funerals. Perhaps I shan't see him again until my own." Dumas the elder's last lover was the famous American actress Ada Menken. Ada was the toast of 2 continents, renowned for a colorful stage performance that required her to ride, bound to a horse, with a dangerous leap at the end of the performance. She was physically fearless, intelligent, and literate, and had been married 4 times. In 1867, Dumas the elder saw her perform and went backstage to congratulate the famous horsewoman. The two made a scandalously fascinating couple. He, at 65, the grand old man of French literature, and she with her young, magnificent body and irrepressible spirit. But Ada died suddenly, and Dumas was very saddened. In 1870, the elder Dumas was partially paralyzed by a stroke, and came to his son saying, "I have come to you to die." Dumas the younger cared for his father until he died later that year. Dumas the younger then said, "He died as he had lived, without noticing." Dumas the younger continued to write morality plays, and he saw himself as something of a teacher and a prophet. He believed that prostitution was the cause of France's underlying social ills, which he thought responsible for government upheavals. Dumas was criticized by both the public and his peers for what seemed to be a dislike of women. He wrote a pamphlet about his views of the male-female relationship, and in it he says, "Women never yield to reason, not even to proof. They must be either in love or cowed. If, after this revelation of the truth, men still persist in making mistakes about women, it will no longer be my fault." He led a very exact life in contrast to his father, and continued as a successful playwright. He campaigned for divorce and against prostitution. He also supported legislation that would help illegitimate children to inherit property, and strongly believed that decent women should be protected from sexual harassment. This was an interesting contrast to his apparently narrow personal views about women. He strongly supported women's social rights and once said that the man who avoids the consequences of fatherhood is a far worse criminal than the man who slips out of doing his duty in the service of his country. In his later years, he was a member of the prestigious French Academy, an organization made up of the leading intellectuals of the time. He was still an attractive man, even in his 60s, and like his father, he too had one last remarkable lover. Henriette Régnier was a beautiful young woman who had known Dumas since childhood. She was unhappily married and very attracted to this famous and charming man. She pursued him, and they became lovers in 1887. In 1890, Henriette obtained a divorce. Dumas felt tortured by once again living a life that contradicted his values. He said, "Faced by the nothingness of life, by the uselessness of all effort, by the despairing cries which we send up to a so-called providence which shows no concern for us, I have sometimes seriously thought of entering a monastery. Oh, don't worry, I should never have the courage to do it. Besides, I should be bored to death." When his wife died in 1895, Dumas married Henriette, but he could feel his physical and mental powers declining quickly. He made out a will that stipulated he was to be buried without any religious ceremony, speeches, or military honors. He died a few months later. At his death, the newspapers were filled with stories about him, and from one of the most famous obituaries comes this quote about the effect Dumas' work had on the public attitude towards prostitution. "Before Camille, our daughters of joy were social outcasts, marked for damnation. In 100 years from now, poor young folk, their hearts pulsating with love, will still be shedding tears over Camille." We will now tell that story, which still does evoke strong emotions. The main characters are Armand, a young Parisian, Marguerite, a highly paid courtesan or lady of the night, and Prudence, a one-time courtesan and Marguerite's friend. Camille is set in Paris in the mid-1800s. The story is told by a narrator who provides a philosophical perspective. It opens as the narrator describes an auction in the former apartments of a kept woman. He describes the morbid curiosity that respectable women have for courtesans, saying, "If there is one thing which women in society like to see, it is the home of those women, who parade in Paris the opulent insolence of their beauty, their diamonds, and their scandal." The narrator admires the superb furnishings in the apartment, and is shocked to discover that it was the apartment of Marguerite Gautier, a woman he had met. He discovers that her things are for sale to cover her debts, and he says to himself, "She must have had a sad death, for in her world one had friends only when one is perfectly well." The narrator describes his sympathy for women who are forced into prostitution, and tells of how he once saw 2 police officers arresting a young prostitute and taking her away from her baby. He also tells the horrible story of an aging prostitute who trained her daughter to take on her trade when she was no longer attractive. The narrator, expressing the sympathies of Dumas, says, "I have an unbounded sympathy for women of this kind, and I do not think it necessary to apologize for this sympathy." The narrator recalls Marguerite, an exceptional beauty, tall and slender with jet-black hair, beautiful lashes veiling her dark eyes, and an almost childlike expression. He says, "Marguerite was always present at every premiere, and passed every evening either at the theatre or the ball. She invariably had 3 things with her: her opera glass, a bag of sweets, and a bouquet of camellias. For 25 days of the month the camellias were white, and for 5 they were red. At the florist's she had come to be called the Lady of the Camellias, and the name stuck." Marguerite had been ill with a weak chest, and while at a spa she met a wealthy and elderly duke whose daughter had just died of tuberculosis. Marguerite's sweet and youthful beauty reminded the duke so much of his daughter that he wanted to care for her. He asked her if she could give up prostitution, and offered to give her anything she wanted in return. At first she consented, but when she returned to Paris she found it impossible not to get swept back into a life of frantic activity and men. The Duke eventually said he would accept her as she was, so long as he could continue to see her when he wanted. The narrator purchases one thing from the estate, a copy of a book called Manon. Manon is the touching story of a converted woman. Inside the book is an inscription which says, Manon to Marguerite, humility. It's signed Armand Duval. One day the narrator receives a visitor, a tall, blond young man whose name is Armand Duval. He is deeply agitated and asks if he might buy back the book. The narrator is curious about their story, but doesn't question Armand. When the narrator refuses to let Armand reimburse him for the high price he paid for the book, Armand shows him a well-worn letter from Marguerite. She tells him in this letter that she is near death, while he is hundreds of miles away. She says that her time with him was the only happy time in her life. She says that as she lies dying, she can hear a watchman in her apartment, put there by her creditors to make sure that nothing is taken out of the apartment. Armand tells the narrator that he received the letter too late to see Marguerite before she died, or to come to the auction. He, recalling Marguerite's lonely death, berates himself, saying, I thought it was I who had to forgive her, and today I feel unworthy of the forgiveness which she grants me. Armand asks the narrator how he can express his gratitude for the book, and the narrator says, by giving me a little of your friendship, and by telling me the cause of your suffering. Armand says that one day he will tell the whole story, but excuses himself for the time being. He leaves, and over the next few weeks, the narrator finds reminders of Marguerite wherever he goes. He even visits her grave, which is covered with camellias ordered by Armand. The narrator helps Armand through a ghastly reburial of Marguerite's body, an event that physically and emotionally devastates the young man. He sees her decomposing body as it is put into a new grave. This shock helps Armand to accept her death, and as he recuperates, he tells the narrator his story. Now the first-person narration reflects Armand's point of view. One evening in Paris, Armand is at the theater with his friend Gaston. He sees Marguerite, but barely recognizes her as she has been unwell. Armand says, for 2 years the sight of this girl had made a strange impression on me whenever I came across her. Without knowing why, I turned pale and my heart beat violently. Many of my friends had noticed, and had been much amused when they saw who it was that made this impression upon me. One evening Armand was introduced to Marguerite, but when she teased him for his obvious infatuation, he abruptly left. He said, women like Marguerite delight in teasing people whom they meet for the first time. It is no doubt a return for the humiliations which they have to submit to every day. Now Armand looks back at those first 2 years of infatuation and laughs. But on the night he's describing, he says that his heart began to beat when he recognized Marguerite. He sees an old friend of his, a former courtesan who is now a dressmaker, in the box next to Marguerite. Her name is Prudence, and Armand goes to her box and asks her about Marguerite. He finds out that she lives next door to Prudence, and that the old Duke is taking care of her in a protective and somewhat jealous manner. Gaston and Armand offer to escort Prudence home, and she invites them in. Prudence tells them that Marguerite calls to her when she comes home, and the two often spend evenings together. Prudence says that Marguerite can't sleep because she's often feverish and has a weak chest. Marguerite comes home and calls out for Prudence to come and help her entertain a boring man who brought her home. Prudence takes Gaston and Armand over to Marguerite's, and Armand's heart beats violently at the thought of meeting her again. When they're reintroduced, Marguerite remembers him and apologizes for being mischievous at their initial meeting. She discovers that he frequently came to her house and inquired after her when she was ill, and she's touched by this. She turns towards the man who's visiting and says, "You wouldn't have done that." The man says, "I have only known you for 2 months." Marguerite says that Armand has only known her for 5 minutes. She is rather scornful of her visitor, who finally leaves. Prudence tells her that the man she was so rude to is wealthy and kind, and Marguerite should treat him better. Armand, however, is pleased to see that Marguerite isn't interested in the man just because he's rich and fashionable. This excuses her in his eyes for all her past faults. Armand, Prudence, Marguerite, and Gaston have a merry late supper. Armand says, "Little by little I withdrew from the noise, and I felt almost sad as I saw this beautiful creature of 20, drinking, talking like a porter, and laughing the more loudly the more scandalous was the joke. This way of talking and drinking seemed in Marguerite a necessity of forgetting a fever, a nervous irritability, and a cough, hardly perceptible at supper, became at last so violent I suffered at the thought of injury to so frail a constitution, which must come from excesses like this. It seemed as if her chest were being torn in two. Her napkin was stained with a drop of blood. She rose and ran into her dressing-room. Armand follows Marguerite and tries to help her through the coughing fit. She somewhat bitterly says, "It is really not worth your while to alarm yourself. Let us go back to supper." He takes her hand, raises it to his lips, and in spite of himself, 2 tears fall upon her hand. He says, "I must seem very silly to you, but I am frightfully troubled by what I have just seen." Marguerite tries to brush off his concerns, saying that what happens to girls like her doesn't matter, and besides she needs to amuse herself with the overexertions of society. Armand wants to take care of her and says that he can cure her if she'll let him. Then, once she's well, she can choose whether or not she wants to return to this life. Marguerite says that the wine is making Armand say such things. She tells him that if he loves her, only 2 things can come from it. She can refuse him, which will make him unhappy, or she can accept him, which he can ill afford. Armand says, "You have become a necessity of my life, and you will drive me mad, not only if you will not love me, but if you will not let me love you." Marguerite says, "I should ruin you in no time, and your family would cast you off if you were to live with a woman like me. Let us be friends, good friends. You have a good heart. You want someone to love you. You are too young and too sensitive to live in a world like mine." But Armand persists and promises to conduct himself in their relationship however Marguerite says, without question. She gives him one of her camellias and says he can return to see her when it fades. She says, "It must seem strange to you that I am ready to take you at a moment's notice. Shall I tell you why?" She puts his hand on her heart, which is beating wildly, and continues, "It is because I shall not live as long as others, and I have promised myself to live more quickly." With this, the affair between Marguerite and Armand begins. The next evening, Armand calls on Marguerite, who is preoccupied until Prudence arrives with money from the Duke. Then Marguerite and Armand are alone and spend their first night together. The next morning he writes, "To be loved by a pure young girl is indeed a great happiness, but it is the simplest thing in the world. To be loved by a courtesan, that is a victory of infinitely greater difficulty. With them, the body has worn out the soul, the senses have burned out the heart, dissipation has blunted out the feelings. When a creature who has all her past to reproach herself with is taken, all at once, by a profound, sincere, irresistible love, of which she had never felt herself capable, when she has confessed her love, how absolutely the man whom she loves dominates her. But when the man who inspires this redeeming love is great enough in soul to receive it without remembering the past, this man drains at one drink all earthly emotions, and after such a love his heart will be closed to every other. The next evening, when he sees her with another man, he can't help feeling jealous, even though he promised her that he would not judge her and would conduct the relationship according to her rules. Marguerite repeatedly chides him for his jealousy. Then Prudence tries to discourage Armand from loving Marguerite, and especially for acting jealous. Prudence points out that since Armand can't keep Marguerite, he should be more than happy to see her when she allows, while other men pay the bills. Prudence says that the sacrifice Marguerite would have to make by loving only Armand would be tremendous. She would have to give up her lifestyle and risk alienating her wealthy patrons. Prudence asks Armand, "What equal sacrifice could you make? And when you had got tired of her, what could you do to make up for what you had taken from her?" Marguerite tells Armand that she has a plan for them to spend the summer in the country, a way to reconcile everything, even her new love for him. She says, "Don't laugh. I am silly enough to love you. Remember that. And don't let anything disturb you." Armand spends another night with her, but the next night he watches her house and sees a man enter in the evening and not depart. He writes her an angry note, in almost the same words that Alexandre Dumas wrote to Marie Duplessis when he broke off with her. Armand writes, "I am not rich enough to love you as I would, and not poor enough to love you as you would." Marguerite doesn't reply, and Armand regrets his childish jealousy. He begs her forgiveness, and she says, "You must either love me a little less or understand me a little better." I once had a little dog who looked at me with a sad look when I coughed. That is the only creature I ever loved. When he died, I cried more than when my mother died. For 12 years of her life, she used to beat me. Women like me have no friends. We have selfish lovers who spend their fortunes, not on us, but on their own vanity. What I loved in you was not the man who was, but the man to be. You do not accept the position I offer you. You reject it as unworthy of you. Do like the others. Pay me and say no more about it. Armand begs her forgiveness and asks her to forget everything except that they love each other. He realizes that he can't change her life, so he changes his own. He begins to gamble and is lucky enough to make some money. Even occasional dinners with Marguerite, the theatre, supper, and flowers are expensive. He finds gambling to be a remedy for his obsession with Marguerite, as well as a source of income. As he spends more evenings with her, her health improves. She spends less time in the hectic Parisian nightlife and more time with him. Her cough almost disappears, and she limits her other male visitors to the elderly Duke. The two go on an all-day excursion in the country and see a charming little house. Soon after, with the Duke's money, Marguerite rents the house, and Armand and she live there in quiet bliss. Marguerite eventually gives up the Duke and begs Armand to swear his love for her. He discovers that she has been selling her jewels and belongings to pay for their life in the country. He's confused and upset. Then Armand's father confronts him about his relationship with Marguerite. He tells his father that Marguerite and he truly love each other, but his father thinks he is a foolish and infatuated young man. Armand tells Marguerite of this conversation, and she becomes anxious and feverish. She insists that he go to Paris to talk to his father. When he does, he finds that his father seems to have had a change of heart regarding Marguerite. When he returns to the country, Marguerite has left for Paris. Since the carriage has been sold, he walks in the rain back to the city, to her house. He finds a letter from her saying that she's going to be the mistress of another man, and that he should go to his family. He runs to his father's hotel and is consoled by the older man, who seems not at all surprised by this turn of events. Armand leaves Paris with his father, and after a month of agony, returns to Paris compelled to see Marguerite again, to love or to hate her. While taking a walk, he sees her out with a very beautiful young woman. His heart beats violently, but he makes a curt bow to Marguerite. Armand, maddened by his loss, decides that Marguerite should suffer as he does. He buys as a mistress the pretty woman he saw with her. He takes every opportunity to hurt Marguerite's feelings, going to the same places that she does with his new mistress. Finally, Marguerite comes to Armand and begs him to stop being unkind to her. She's not well, and her illness has made her emaciated and weak. Armand and Marguerite immediately rekindle their love for each other. They spend the night together, and she tells him he can come to her whenever he wants, but he must never plan for her in his future. Armand writes of their last night together. All Marguerite's life seemed to have passed into the kisses with which she covered me, and I loved her so much that in my transports of feverish love I asked myself whether I should not kill her, so that she might never belong to another. The next day he goes to her home and finds that another man is there. Still jealous, he writes her this note: "You went away so suddenly that I forgot to pay you. Here is the price of your night." He includes a large sum of money. By the next day he is in a tremendous state of agitation. A messenger returns his money and his note, and he discovers that Marguerite has left for England. Armand then leaves on a long trip to the Far East, and while traveling discovers that Marguerite is seriously ill. He writes to her, and the letter she wrote to him in response is the letter he showed the narrator at the beginning of the story. But the letter came too late. Armand also shows the narrator some letters Marguerite wrote on her deathbed. In them she says that Armand's father begged her to leave the young man. Unbeknownst to Armand, the family of his sister's fiancé threatened to stop his sister's wedding if Armand continued in his relationship with her. Although she was devastated by her loss, Marguerite was inspired to sacrifice Armand for another woman. Marguerite writes, "I became transformed. These new feelings silenced the memory of the happy days I had spent with you." Marguerite, in these last letters, recounts the pain of Armand's insults and his mistress. She says that each fresh insult brought her a kind of love, because it proved that Armand still loved her, and would love her even more when he knew what she had sacrificed. She writes, "I had a sort of hope that I should kill myself by all these excesses. I became a body without a soul. But Marguerite's livelihood is over." She writes, "I was pale and sad and thinner than ever. Men who buy love examine the goods before taking them. At Paris there were women in better health. I was rather forgotten." As she nears death, she writes, "I am almost sorry that I listened to your father. If I had known that I should only be taking a year of your future, I could not have resisted, and at least I should have died with a friend to hold my hand." When Marguerite is too ill to write, a companion chronicles her last days, as the creditors eagerly await her death so that they can sell her belongings. Every time the door to her room opens, she thinks it will be Armand, and when it isn't, the brightness again goes out of her eyes, and her face resumes its sorrowful expression. Finally, the doctor sends a priest to give Marguerite the last rites of the Catholic Church. Not long after, with Armand's name on her lips, she dies. The narrator says, "I wrote this story just as it had been told me. I do not draw the conclusion that all women like Marguerite are capable of doing all that she did, but I have discovered that one of them experienced a serious love in the course of her life, that she suffered for it, and that she died of it. I have told the reader all that I have learned." Alexandre Dumas had one basic subject in his writings: love. Whether this love was between man and woman or parent and child, the important point was that he tried desperately to explain love. In his eyes there was nothing as important. Although he seemed to be a haughty moralist, his subject matter was the most tender. In one of his obituaries it was said about Dumas, "Arrogance had covered with a thin crust the most vulnerable of hearts." The immortality of Camille is not in the dated plot or the melodramatic action. Camille still touches audiences because it deals with the mysterious nature of love, sensuous, divine, forgiving, paternal. These are the manifestations of love we see in Camille and in life. The story best lives on in the opera La Traviata, where music conveys the gaiety of Marguerite's Parisian life, the thrill of Armand's desire for her, and the sweetness of Marguerite's sacrifice to a sister she will never know. In the opera we find these words, which poetically describe the object of Alexandre Dumas' quest, the lyrics sung by a young but world-weary courtesan, inspired by the selfless love of a man. She sings, "Love is the heartbeat of the universe, of the entire universe. Mysterious, mysterious and proud, torment, torment and delight, the delight of my heart. This love that is the heartbeat of the universe."
This is the end of the session.